Every day, season 2 is here now. Perrin's wolfiness is showing him what happened. All those smells and sights will surely show the way. Hey, hey. Blink, blink, blink it went in the books. Were you wondering how they would deal with showing us Perrin's abilities and worried that we'd get talking wolves? Well, in today's video, we get some more insight on how his abilities are developing, and we'll relate it to the things that we read in the books. I know that you're going to find loads more things with me, as I always find so much when I'm stopping to look at this scene by scene. Okay, are we ready? Let's get into it. I'm Koala Sedai, and I am just loving breaking down season 2 of The Wheel of Time, scene by scene, and sharing it with you. The scene we're examining today is from episode 2, and I've numbered it as scene 3, but technically it's more than one scene. It's a collection of scenes going from when the Shinaran group are riding out and they find the village that's been ransacked by Fane and his group. Please do take a moment to like, subscribe, feel free to share this and comment away. I love hearing your thoughts. So we start off with Uno. He's just sniffing the bloody air and it's not proper tracking. Well, marvellous to open with Uno cursing away, and even better that it's just totally accepted as being normal by the people he's with, rather than him having to try to hold it back all the time. And I mean, there were some fun things about that in the book, but I love the way Uno just gets to be himself. Now, Huron was a Shinaran from Faldara. He was a sniffer, also a thief taker, and that is someone with a unique ability to smell violence, and he could track people who did the violence. From this alone, it would have been easy to bring Huron into the show as they travelled from Faldara to chase Fane and the Horn. I like to imagine the discussions in the writer's room as they went through the options of how they were going to portray all of this, and the option to have Huron in the show. And on top of his book talents, he could have also been a wolf brother. I reckon they might have discussed that and weighed it up compared to bringing Elias in a season later than he came in during the books, and merging him into the role that Huron played. To be honest, I think they could have made either choice work, as Perrin in the books ends up taking Huron's place after he goes through the portal stone with Ran and Loyal. Or did that make this be the best choice because not all sniffers are wolf brothers, but wolf brothers have the ability of sniffers? That's a good one to ponder, actually. Perrin is still happily riding a horse, but Elias knows that doesn't work so well for him, as horses don't like him that close. However, Huron does ride a horse, so sniffing can be done by horseback, no matter what is being said here in this scene. Books, especially long stories like The Wheel of Time, can quite easily give exposition for pages without it being boring to the reader. Ingtar knows a bit about Huron and brings him along, but doesn't let Rand know about him until they're away from Faldara, and that was so that the Aes Sedai didn't get wind of him. So we got a lot of information about all of that in the books. Now here in the show, it's Perrin riding along with Ingtar, and we can't spend even a couple of minutes learning about how sniffers work, let alone all of his backstory, etc. Instead, we just learn a little more each time we get Elias in a scene, and we have to fill in a lot of it from what we're shown. And by combining Elias in as the sniffer, we also get to learn a lot more about Perrin and his wolf abilities. In the books, Euron goes to length to explain how he can smell violence, specifically the killing and the hurting. He says that every trail is different, and so he wouldn't have a chance of mixing them up. So like if two people had done violence, their trails had crossed or they'd been together for a while and then separated, he would be able to split them up and know who he was following. Now, mostly we hear, cursing that he's just sniffing the air, and then we get all that gorgeous facial acting by Elias. One thing I never noticed until I rewatched, and then even more as I was writing this episode, is that there is actually a ferry over there on the other side of that bank. And I'm really laughing now because each time I had watched this episode, I would find myself thinking, look, how the hell did they get across that river without getting wet? Even if there was a ford, they would have been a bit wet. And I just put it down to in-continuity shit that happens in shows. But now, as I do these breakdowns, I watch the scene again, like quite slowly, and then I take a cut of the scene and I convert it to still shots. And now I finally see it. Hang on, that actually is a ferry on the other side. And that made me start thinking, but surely they would have pulled the ferry back across and gone over on it. Now, maybe the ropes are cut, but why show us the ferry and not say they've cut the ropes so we can't use the ferry? I spent way too much time overthinking this, watching the scene, reading the transcript that I downloaded from Reddit. Now, when I look at that, it says they reach a river and see a structure on the other side. Then it says they dismount and cross the river on foot. So this actually goes along with what we hear Ingtar say, which is, let's go over wherever we can find a crossing. However, after much deliberation, I've decided they did use the ferry, and that's why they're not wet. The ferry is not huge. That is why they had to leave the horses with Loyal, because this way they could all cross in one go, and they don't really need a sturdy ferry just for a handful of people. But to put horses on, you really need to know it's a strong ferry. Then there's the line Ingtar says while they're looking across the water. They crossed here. Something doesn't feel right. Well, this could be why he doesn't want to haul the ferry back and use it. Is it a trap? And that goes along with stuff that I'll talk about soon that was in the books. However, if they walked across, that makes no sense, because you would ride the horses across a ford. If you found a ford that was shallow enough to walk across, you would ride the horses across. Because even if there is a trap on the other side, don't you want to be able to flee on your horses? Not have to run back across a river and then get your horses and then be able to start galloping away? A small example of why I like to rewatch and really think about scenes is, it was such an easy presumption that I'd made, and then it's become such a fun rabbit hole that I got to explore. Now let's go and read chapter 10 in The Great Hunt. Feel free to pause this and go and actually read some of it, or you might open it up and just look at it while you're listening to me, because I'm going to reference more of this throughout this whole episode here. But for now, I just want to look at the bit where they get to a small group of empty houses. This, of course, is Rand, Mat and Perrin with the group from Shinar. They can see the buildings and there's no movement of any kind, and they're concerned about an ambush. So that links up with Ingtar looking across the river and thinking something's not right. They check around, however, and find that they're indeed empty. And then they stand and they look across the river. So in the book, they've come up to a small group of houses and then they're looking across the river. So the houses are on the side of the river they're on. And they see a barge-like ferry on a thick rope spanning the distance, and the ferry is sat snug against the other side. Well, blow me down. That is exactly what we are seeing in this scene. Perrin mutters that he doesn't like the smell of this place. Uno says, bloody dark friends and Trollocs went straight through, my lord. Straight through to the goat-kissing ferry, which they bloody left on the other side. So I love it because I love the way the show twists and turns and flips things, because this is kind of the opposite. They approach the houses from the land and the ferry is on the opposite bank, not hindering them from getting to the houses, but hindering them from continuing their chase of the group of dark friends. Ingtar sends two of the men across to get the ferry and even comments that it doesn't look big enough to take everyone over in one trip. Again, that's what we're seeing here in the show. It's over on the far bank once they get across that they find, we'll get to that. So, what do you think? Did they walk across a ford and miraculously not get wet? Or did they use the ferry? Okay, I'm coming up for air again out of that rabbit hole. It isn't really even all that important, but it's funny how my brain can grasp something and just run off with it anyway. Before I move on to the next part of this scene, though, I just want to make a note of the interesting use of words they give Uno for his cursing in this scene. He calls Elias a goat-licking bastard. Now, I went searching and, for example, in The Great Hunt, I found some really interesting references to goats when cursing or throwing insults is used, and none of them had people licking any goats. We do get insults such as being a goat-brained fool, people being goat-kissing, which is the most popular, your mother was a goat, or someone being referenced as having the face of a goat. I'd love to know, if you're listening to this, I'd love to know if anyone out there listening knows of any book instance that goat licking is used, because I couldn't find any. It would seem that it appears to just be for show, or for the show. In the book version of this scene, in fact, Uno refers to the goat-kissing ferry. So again, the little twists and flips just totally tickle my funny bone every single time, because I did use goat-kissing in the book and then goat-licking in the show. Okay, so we're now across the water, one way or another, and we find some abandoned buildings. It makes sense for the show just to do everything on one side of the river, and this is not an exact replica of the book. It's not trying to be, and it is a combination of events in the book that happen, over a span of time and over a couple of different locations. In the book, it's Uno who thinks he sees a woman in the window. He races in, and it's a 2-story house, and he races right through it up the stairs and finds no one there. That's the end of that, with some snide comments from Matt about curtains, and they move to discussing where the party of dark friends went next, and Huron's detecting all the violence and death. Now, granted, the ferry crossing in the book takes up a couple of pages, and we don't need that in the show. And yep, I'm back to that again. I know, I can't help it. Because the thing is, we didn't even need to see them use the ferry in the show. Just the fact they showed it would have been enough to have Ingtar tell 2 men to go retrieve it. And then they could have still just moved on to the scene of them walking up to the buildings from the other side, and we would have known that's how they got there without getting soaking wet. Anyway, after Perrin thinks he sees a woman in the window, he enters the house. In the books, they've crossed the river and they find the 2 dark friends that have been skinned alive. Then they ride off, and what Perrin now sees is very similar to what Rand discovers when he walks into a house, and we get that blink scene where it just keeps replaying. So I'm just going to read for you the description from the book. A smiling, bald-headed man in rough clothes laid a slice of meat on a plate held by a woman with a worn face. She was smiling too, though. She added peas and turnips to the plate and passed it to one of the children lining the table. There were 6 children, boys and girls, from nearly grown down to barely tall enough to look over the table. The woman said something, and the girl, taking the plate from her, laughed. The man started to cut another slice. Suddenly, another girl screamed, pointing at the door to the street. The man dropped the carving knife and whirled. Then he screamed too, face tight with horror, and snatched up a child. The woman grabbed another and motioned desperately to the others, her mouth working frantically, silently. They all scrabbled toward a door in the back of the room. That door burst open and... blink. Now in the show, Perrin walks in and sees a boy and a girl running up to the kitchen table, and they're laughing. Another child is sitting at the table, and a man. The mother is bringing a plate of meat or maybe turnips and peas to the table, and she's smiling. Perrin begins to speak to them, apologising for walking in. Ingtar looks at Perrin like, what the fuck? It appears that the family begin to look towards Perrin, and we see another child at the table and the father carving the meat up. They stop smiling, and a scream is actually heard. So in the books it was silent. A dark friend rushes in to attack, and the father attempts to fight him off but's killed. A Doorddraal attacks from the other side. Perrin's turning in horror, watching it all happen, and sees Ingtar just standing beside him, and completes his turn to see Elias coming to the door. It's kind of like he comes out of a bit of a trance, and suddenly flies are swarming all the rotting food on the table, and there are no people there. In the book version, it got even more creepy, with flies covering the table and the walls, and Rand even crawling into his mouth and nose, and he feels this incredible coldness and ends up channeling to break out of it all. In the show version, Perrin only sees the vision once. It doesn't keep replaying. I have to admit that this scene in the books is creepy as all fuck, but it didn't really ever go anywhere in the scope of the story of the Wheel of Time as a whole. It isn't like this happened more times with Rand and turned out to be something Targaryen or something to do with his use of the One Power. It just happened here and the concept went away. So in the show, we get the same kind of scene, but in a way that brings us to a deeper understanding of some of Perrin's wolf abilities. So they really had a reason for bringing this scene in. We already knew that through his wolf link he can smell what's happened, and that this can convert to seeing what's happened. So it works to build on this knowledge with him seeing this, and then this really smart thing of him turning around and trying to blame it on Elias. Now, I get to what could have become another rabbit hole, but I won't make it too deep a rabbit hole this time, which is the comment that Elias makes, because I find this intriguing. He says, useful to know the difference between vision and reality. You don't get lost so easily. So the rabbit hole is, I started to think, well, just what does Elias mean? Now, you could see that when Perrin was first watching this scene, he thought it was reality and he thought it was really happening. And that's why he even went to start speaking to the people, thinking that they could see him as well. So was Elias simply saying, well, it's useful, that you can tell the difference? But he said you don't get lost so easily. Just what exactly does he mean by getting lost? Now, in the books, Perrin is very worried that he will become like Noam and forget his humanity completely and take off and become wolf. He never seems to really quite come to terms with the fact that Elias totally accepts his wolfiness and yet did not become Noam. And he is always looking for that balance. He's usually at first trying to just get rid of the wolf stuff and then just use it the little bit he wants to, but keep it at bay. Always so worried about, what might happen if it takes over him. So was Elias alluding to that kind of concept that if Perrin can understand the difference, then he won't get lost? Or did he mean that he can walk into this vision and that he could actually get lost or become stuck in there? Now, if he did mean something like that, was there some kind of an inference that these wolfiness visions Perrin has are somehow linked to Tel'aran'rhiod or, to the wolf dream as Perrin so often considers Tel'aran'rhiod to be? So as I was writing this and really pondering on it, I decided to go out to Twitter of Time and see what others think. And honestly, I've only got a few responses here because I only put it out a couple of hours ago. And so I was just lucky to catch a few people who saw it go by and have had a little bit to say. Kevin Angus said, I interpreted this as him seeing that Perrin was too immersed within the vision, reacting like they were reality and making himself an easy target for potential enemies. The wolves would want him to receive and interpret a vision without freezing or making himself vulnerable. Well, that is a really interesting point. I didn't even think about the fact that if Perrin was stopped still and immersed in the vision, that potentially any enemy could walk up and grab him. So I appreciate that thought. It's really interesting. Goldeneyes Sedai, oh my goodness, I hope I pronounced that correctly. I'll just blame my Aussie accent if I didn't, said, I think they're changing the wolf dream to what we saw in season 2. So instead of the warning being, you are here too strongly, young pup, it will be differentiating between vision and reality. I really liked this because, as I said before, are they going to somehow link these visions to his wolf dream stuff? And I think that there could be a link there between you're here too strongly and pushing Perrin out of the wolf dream and Elias saying you could get lost in here. So I'm going to be really looking out for this in season 3, that's for sure. Cascadia said, I don't know if it's what he meant, but getting lost made me think of that one fella Perrin met back in book 3 who went full wolf and was suffering being a wolf brain in a man body. he lost himself to the wolf dream or something. And that was exactly the kind of thing that I said I was thinking of, that this comment by Elias was a reference that as book readers we immediately remember what happened to Noam, and know that that is a real fear that Perrin has. So again, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with that. Rapunzel also gave a really interesting personal insight into this. Some people with ADHD experience hallucinations. So that made me think, well, hang on, we have to be clear on the meaning of this word. So a hallucination is a false perception of objects or events involving your senses, which could be sight, sound, smell, touch, and even taste. Hallucinations seem real, but they're not. Chemical reactions and or abnormalities in your brain cause hallucinations. So by this definition, was Perrin hallucinating? Well, yes, because what he was seeing was not actually happening, but also no, because what he was seeing was what did in fact happen. Just it happened earlier, so it was more that he was seeing the residue of what had happened. Back to the great point from Rapunzel, however, is that she reports that when this happens, one can be having a conversation with someone and begin to see hallucinations about them, even to the point of them being mutilated. My God, that must be how Min sometimes was feeling. So Rapunzel felt that there was two useful things there in what Elias was saying. Number one, knowing it's a vision and not reacting to it helps people not think you're too crazy, or, that you're a bit less crazy at least. And secondly, you're better prepared mentally when you have to deal with something like that for real. Perrin's internal thoughts are always preoccupied with being cautious not to hurt anyone. If he had stepped into that attack with the vision Doorddraal, Ingtar was in fact standing in that same spot, which would have been bad. Plus the gnome factor and getting lost in the wolfiness. So thanks for that, Rapunzel. Now, this then led me to start thinking about how dogs see with their sense of smell. There have been some studies that have shown that dogs, and I just want to make note here that we remember that all of our dogs evolved from wolves, so this does include wolves, have extensive pathways connecting the olfactory bulb, which is the part of the brain that interprets smells, to the occipital lobe, which is the part of the brain that processes what you see. So that is something that only dogs have, apparently. Now, we also have to think about the fact that sight is as much of a brain function as it is an eye function. And you might wonder what I mean by that, so I'll try and explain. Think of an example where you could walk into a room that you've never been in before, and you would have to spend some time just looking around to become acquainted with the room and all the objects that are in there. When you walk in there, for example, are there any cushions on the lounge? Are there 4 or 5 chairs at the little table? Is there a kettle sitting there? And actually, that's really an Australian thing, right? Me, as an Australian, I'd be looking for a kettle, and most of you in America, I found, didn't use kettles. So, there's all this stuff that's going on with your brain as you're looking about that is interpreting what your eyes are focusing on. So on the other hand, another person could walk into that room and they happen to be the person who owns that room, and they walk in a moment later and immediately, at one glance, they just know that someone has been in there and moved some of the objects. You hadn't even seen most of those objects, even if you'd been in there for several minutes. So dogs, on the other hand, walk into a room and just as conveniently their nose physically leads the way, they're smelling everything that's in there and interpreting what they see according to what they smell. So that's a really big point. They will smell objects, even ones that to us have no real smell, and they will smell the path of movement of other living creatures through those objects. Dogs can even interpret the smells in association with emotions and memories. This means, for example, they may have a happy memory of a particular person or some object such as a toy and respond to that emotional memory on entering the room if the person is there, or even if the person has been in there while they were away, or the same for the toy. This, to me, begins to sound really similar to Perrin entering his house and being able to build a visual memory of what went on in that house out of the smells that have been left behind. So, was he being given those visions by the other wolves, or was this simply a wolfy ability he has with his sense of smell? The fact that we have a sniffer in the books, and Perrin obviously shared some of those abilities in the books, says to me that this is a talent that he has through his wolf connection that he's learning to use. The next thing that happens in this scene is Perrin accuses Elias of doing this to him and is told it just doesn't work that way. I half expected Elias to say, "You young pup," but the look on his face said it, so it was fine. I can read it in there. I love the way that we actually get no further explanation. It's enough to make the viewer wonder, how does this actually work? And probably they could start to come up with some ideas of their own and be looking out for this in future seasons. In the book, Rand comes out of that building and joins up with Matt and Perrin, only to find that they didn't have any visions like he had. And so, in other words, in the book, Rand was the only one this happened to. Now, it's interesting that we don't see it happen to Elias, but then I'm sure that that's simply because we have not yet had anything in the show that is like an Elias point of view. So maybe that will come and we'll actually sort of see Elias maybe have one of these types of visions and realise that he does get exactly what Perrin gets. So Rand comes out of the building in the book, joins up with Matt and Perrin, and there's a shout from further down in the village square, and they head down there together to see what that's all about. In the show, Perrin comes out of the building and Masema comes up to them all and says there's something they need to see. And there we go. We get the iconic Doorddraal scene. This is how this scene is described in the books. There was a man spread-eagled across the doors with thick spikes through wrists and shoulders. More spikes had been driven into his eyes to hold his head up. Dark, dried blood made fans down his cheeks. Scuff marks on the wood behind his boots showed that he had been alive when it was done. Well, when it began anyway. Rand's breath caught. Not a man. Those black clothes, blacker than black, had never been worn by any human. The wind flapped an end of the cloak caught behind the body, which it did not always. He knew too well. The wind did not always touch those clothes, but there had never been any eyes in that pale, bloodless face. Murderer, he breathed, and it was as if his speaking released all the others. They began to move again and breathe. Who, Matt began, and had to stop to swallow. Who could do this to a fade? His voice squeaked at the end. I don't know, Ingtar said. I do not know. He looked around, examining faces, or perhaps counting to be sure everyone was there. And I do not think we will learn anything here. We ride. Mount. Huron, find the trail out of this place. Yes, my lord, yes, with pleasure. That way, my lord. They're still heading south. They rode away, leaving the dead Doorddraal where it hung, the wind stirring its black cloak. Huron was first beyond the wall, not waiting on Ingtar for a change, but Rand came close behind him. To all intents and purposes, that Doorddraal is nailed up in the show just like described in the books. The arms are spread-eagled. Now, the left arm is definitely spiked through the wrist, but it looks to me as though the right actually has it in the palm, which doesn't really make sense because that would just rip the hand apart. But maybe I just can't quite get a clear enough capture of the still, and I can't see any spikes in the shoulders, but I would have to say I don't know how successfully you would nail shoulders to a wall, but I know a little bit about things I've read about how to crucify a person, but I don't call myself an expert on it. I love how the camera comes right in close on the boots first and hovers there so that we clearly see the scuff marks on the door and that the Doorddraal have spurs on their boots. What I love about that is that was a real thing in the book, was that whole idea of that Doorddraal was not nailed up to the door after it was somehow killed. It was alive and nailed to the door alive. And so the show made that really, really clear. And then in case viewers who haven't read the books didn't quite get the gist of it, Masema gets to say that he was alive when it was done to him. Uno then asks, who could do this to a fade? And Ingtar, like in the books, replies that he doesn't know. Now, I thought it was really interesting that Perrin then actually pipes up and asks, you think it was Padden Fane? Now, I never once thought of Fane the first time I read the books. Maybe others did. Other people are nerdier and cleverer than I am, and they might have suspected that it was Fane who did it on the first read, but I didn't think that it was that obvious. So I was really surprised that they made it so clear in the show that there was a possibility that Fane could have done that by having Perrin just literally ask it out loud. However, I wonder how many viewers who haven't read the books were actually able to grab that little nugget, absorb it, and then wonder about it later, especially if they only watch the show through once. They're all quite shaken now, and Ingtar announces that they'll return to the village by the river for the night. In the books, they leave very shaken as well, and Ingtar calls an early halt as he chooses a place he feels is going to be the most easily defended for that night, rather than just making more distance and risking sleeping somewhere hard to defend. So we certainly got a lot in this scene, and when I started writing this, I knew it was a lot, but I actually had no idea I was going to go that deep into some twisty tangles. We got a good bit of Uno cursing, some stream crossing, but not crossing the streams, visions and flies, and best of all, a Doorddraal. I hope you've enjoyed this breakdown. Did I miss anything? especially with some of the twisty turns and deliberations that I had. Who knows what I could have missed? Well, you might know. Is there something you notice going on there that harps back to, reflects, or is a total flip on something that happened in the books? I'd love to know anything else that you can see in this. So please do also take a moment to like, subscribe, share, comment away here or on Twitter. I love hearing your thoughts. I'll be back with more as soon as I can. Thanks for watching. I'm Koala Sedai, and I love the Wheel of Time.